I'm 68 years old today, and it took me almost my entire life to admit that the story I told myself wasn't whole. For decades, I repeated the same phrases as if they were absolute truths, as if they had been written in stone. They said it was normal. They said it was the best for everyone. They said there was nothing to be done. I listened, believed, and moved on, because that was what was expected of me. But time does not erase what has been pushed under the rug. It just accumulates dust, heaviness, and silence. For a long time, I thought maturity would be accepted without question. Swallow questions, adjust the heart, and keep functioning. I was taught not to bother, not to mess with what was already solved. And so, year after year, I built a whole life on decisions that weren't really mine. I said everything was fine, but my body never completely agreed. There was a tiredness that did not go away, a constant feeling of carrying something that had no name, but that had always been there. When I look back, I realize how I was trained to believe the versions that were handed to me. There were no shouts, no scandals. Just calm sentences, spoken by adults who seemed to know more than I did. Don't talk about it. It's better this way. You need to be strong. These words shaped my way of existing in the world. I believed them because it was easier than facing the possibility that something profoundly wrong had been done, and that I had participated in it with my silence. My sister's absence was treated as a fait accompli, something that did not deserve review. She simply left. That was the official explanation, repeated so many times that it became part of the landscape. At first, I felt confusion and fear, but I was quickly guided to occupy another place, that of the person in charge, the one who solves, the one who holds everything so that no one collapses. At that moment, I didn't realize that by accepting this role, I was also accepting not to ask anything else. Today I understand that aging is not just accumulating years, but carrying memories that have never been revisited. Some lie dormant, others throb in silence. Mine throbbed for decades. Whenever someone mentioned family, I felt a tightness in my chest. Whenever I saw a mother with her children, something in me would withdraw. I couldn't explain it, but there was an old sadness, stuck somewhere between obedience and guilt. I spent my life believing that I did what needed to be done. That taking responsibility was synonymous with virtue. That giving up questions was a form of love. It was only very late that I began to suspect that this reasoning had been carefully constructed to keep me quiet. No one forbade me to speak openly. It was not necessary. I had already learned on my own that certain truths were not welcome. There are nights when I wake up remembering small details, almost insignificant at the time. An interrupted look. A phrase that remained in the air. An uncompleted order. In my youth, I didn't have the tools to interpret that. Today, these memories come back loaded with another weight, as if they were waiting for the right moment to be understood. Maybe that moment will only come when we no longer have time to waste pretending we don't see it. I've always been told that time heals everything. I don't agree anymore. Time only teaches us to live with what has not been resolved. It teaches you to smile at the right times, to fulfill obligations, to play roles. But he does not heal what has been forcibly silenced. On the contrary, it makes silence become part of identity. I became someone who was reliable, strong, discreet, and deeply tired. I know that many would look at my life and say that everything went well. I raised children, formed a family, survived. But there is a huge difference between surviving and living in peace. Something always told me that there was a story badly told, an absence poorly explained. I just didn't have the courage to follow that thought to the end. Questioning meant destabilizing everything I had sustained for so long. Now, at 68 years old, I understand that the greater weight was not what happened, but what was normalized later. Silence accepted. The unique version. Blame distributed in the wrong way. This story starts here because it was here that I finally stopped repeating what I was told, and started listening to what I always tried to silence. Some truths do not scream. They wait. And it took me a lifetime to listen. If you chose to stay and hear this story, it says a lot about who you are. What comes next isn't just something personal, it's a truth that a lot of people carry in silence. If you believe these stories need to keep being told, subscribe to the channel. That's how you help me not let those voices fade away. I was born into a family where things were never really discussed. Everything worked based on looks, short sentences, and decisions already made before anyone even dared to ask. From an early age, I learned that there were subjects that were allowed and others that simply did not exist. Not because they were not important, but because they were inconvenient. I grew up understanding that questioning was synonymous with disrespect and that accepting in silence was a form of love. This logic shaped not only my childhood, but the woman I became. Our house has always seemed organized to the eyes of outsiders. No scandalous fights, no explicit drama. But there was a constant, almost invisible rigidity that controlled every movement. My parents believed they were protecting us by deciding everything for us. They said they knew what was best, and we learned to agree. I don't remember great demonstrations of affection, but I remember very well the feeling of always being observed, evaluated, molded. My mother had a calm way of imposing her will. She didn't scream. All it took was a firm tone of voice and a prolonged look for any resistance to disappear. My father was rarely directly involved. He silently agreed, which made it all the more definitive. That combination taught him early on that there was nowhere to run. When the two were aligned, there was no alternative. The decision was ready, and the role of the children was to accept. Financially, we never had much, but we also never went through extreme need. We lived simply, with clear rules about what was possible and what was not. Maybe that's why we were always told to be grateful. Grateful for the house, for the food, for the structure. This discourse made any dissatisfaction seem like ingratitude. I learned to swallow discomfort because there was always someone reminding me that it could be worse. Since I was a child, I was seen as responsible. The one that helped, the one that obeyed, the one that didn't create problems. That earned me praise, but it also tied me to a role that was hard to let go. The more I lived up to expectations, the more they grew. I became someone reliable, predictable, moldable. And, without realizing it, I began to confuse my value with my ability to endure everything in silence. My sister, on the other hand, has always been different. Not in the sense of open rebellion, but there was a restlessness in her that bothered her. She asked questions. I questioned small things. He showed a desire to live in a way that did not fit into the family's plans. This was never said out loud, but it was felt. It was watched more closely, corrected more often, as if it needed to be constantly adjusted. I saw all this happening and, even so, I didn't see it as something wrong. It was the world I knew. When my sister shut up after a difficult conversation, I thought that was how it worked. When she gave in, I saw it as maturity. No one taught me that it had too high an emotional cost. Nobody talked about feelings. We talked about duty, responsibility, and reputation. Family gatherings were always the same. Superficial conversations, suppressed laughter, no apparent conflict. But there was a constant tension, as if everyone knew where to step so as not to cross invisible limits. I grew up training this care, this emotional vigilance. I learned to measure words, to avoid subjects, to anticipate reactions. This behavior accompanied me out of that house and became part of my personality. Today, looking back, I realize that that environment prepared us to accept the unacceptable. When something went wrong, the answer was never to investigate, but to adjust. Adjusting people, silencing wills, pushing problems out of sight. That was how the family kept united. And I, without realizing it, became one of the biggest defenders of this fragile balance, even if it cost someone dearly. It was in this fertile ground of silence and control that everything that would come after found space to happen. Nothing came out of nowhere. My sister's disappearance, years later, was not an isolated accident. It was the natural result of a structure that did not tolerate deviations. At the time, I was not aware of it. But today I know that the silence did not begin when she left. He had lived with us long before. Before everything happened, my sister was someone difficult to define within our family. She was not openly disobedient, nor did she make scandals. What set her apart was something more subtle. She didn't fit in easily. There was a constant restlessness in her, as if she were always a little out of place. As I adapted to the rules almost automatically, she seemed to feel each boundary as a real, physical weight that's hard to ignore. From a young age, our differences were clear, even when no one talked about it. I accepted guidance without question. She listened, but her eyes betrayed that something didn't make sense. Sometimes, after a conversation with our parents, she would be silent for hours. Other times, he tried to argue, carefully, choosing words that didn't sound like a challenge. It rarely worked. Still, she tried. My sister had simple dreams, but they seemed too big for that environment. He wanted to choose his own path, to make decisions without asking permission for everything. None of this was radical, but within our family, any desire for autonomy was seen as ingratitude. I remember hearing her say, more than once, that she felt trapped. At the time, I thought it was exaggerated. Today, I understand that she was just naming something that I pretended not to feel. She was a good mother. I never questioned that. He loved his children in a present, attentive way, even carrying fatigue and frustration. But this love was also observed, evaluated, as if there was always someone ready to tell her what she did wrong. Constant small criticisms, unsolicited advice, decisions made by her being reviewed by others. All of this was piling up, wearing out little by little. Over time, I noticed that it began to decrease. He spoke less, smiled less, shared less. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he learned that his words rarely changed anything. When she tried to set limits, she was called difficult. When he gave in, they said he was finally understanding his place. This emotional game left her confused, tired, increasingly isolated within her own family. I saw these signs, but I didn't interpret them as warnings. At that moment, I still believed that adaptation was synonymous with maturity. I thought that if she just accepted things as they were, everything would be easier. I even advised her to be patient, not to pick unnecessary fights. Today, this memory weighs me more than any other, because I realize how much I contributed to making her feel alone. There was also constant control over her choices. Where he went, who he talked to, what he planned. Nothing was explicit enough to be called an imposition, but everything was directed. The suggestions were loaded with expectation. The refusals, of disapproval. Gradually, her freedom was reduced to small concessions, always supervised. I remember moments when she looked at me as if she wanted to say something important, but gave up halfway. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he knew I wasn't ready to listen. I was too busy keeping the balance, being the piece that doesn't fail, that doesn't question. Without realizing it, I became another wall between her and any possibility of real support. Before she disappeared, my sister was already emotionally distant. Not for lack of love, but for exhaustion. She always seemed tired, even when she slept. He carried a contained sadness, difficult to explain. Today I recognize these signs with painful clarity. At the time, I thought it was just a difficult phase, something that would pass if she adjusted better. Nothing that happened afterwards came about suddenly. My sister's disappearance was preceded by many small silences, many forced concessions, many frustrated attempts to exist outside the imposed mold. I didn't see the danger because I was trained to normalize discreet suffering. And that's something I take with me to this day. The day my sister left had no announcement, no farewell. There were no visible suitcases, no long explanations. It was an event treated with a strange naturalness, as if it had already been decided before it even happened. I remember waking up with a confused feeling, realizing that something had changed, but not understanding exactly what. No one seemed surprised. This, today, draws my attention more than anything else. The first sentences came quickly, almost rehearsed. They said she needed a break, that he had chosen to follow another path, that it was better not to insist. The words were spoken calmly, as if they were explaining something obvious. I listened in silence, trying to organize my thoughts, but everything seemed out of place. Still, I didn't ask any questions. Not because I didn't want to, but because I felt there was no room for them. My sister's name began to be avoided immediately. When someone mentioned something that could lead to it, the subject was skillfully diverted. It was as if everyone had received the same invisible instruction, not to touch the subject. That caused me discomfort, but also a strange relief. If no one spoke, maybe it really was something simple. Perhaps I was exaggerating any uneasiness. The children were what destabilized me the most at that moment. Too small to understand, too big not to feel. They asked for their mother, cried at times, were silent at others. The answer they gave us was always vague. She had to leave. She loves you. Now you are safe. I repeated these phrases, even though I felt that something essential was missing from them. There was no formal meeting to decide anything. Things just happened. The children started to spend more time with me. Then they started sleeping at my house. Before long, no one questioned where they would live. The decision seemed obvious to everyone, except for me, who felt the weight of that responsibility set in without warning. I remember someone saying that I was always the strongest. That I would be able to handle. That it made sense to be like that. These words, which should sound like a compliment, hooked me even more to the role they expected of me. Accepting seemed the only possible option. Refusing would mean causing a problem. And I had learned early on that causing trouble was unforgivable. There was a specific moment when I thought about going after my sister. To try to understand better, to hear her version. But that idea was quickly drowned out by subtle comments. She doesn't want contact. It's better to respect. It's just going to confuse the kids. Each of these sentences worked as an emotional block. Gradually, I began to believe that insisting would be selfish on my part. The silence was consolidated so efficiently that, in a short time, it seemed to have always been like this. The questions have decreased. The routine has been reorganized. The children started calling me when they needed something. And I started to act as if that new configuration was definitive, even though it had never been officially discussed. Inside, there was fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of failing, fear of not being enough. But there was also a strange sense of accomplishment. I was doing what needed to be done. At least that's what everyone said. And I needed to believe in that to move forward without falling apart. Today, when I revisit that day, I realize how carefully everything has been normalized. My sister's disappearance was not treated as a rupture, but as an adjustment. And I was the piece that allowed this adjustment to happen without noise. That day, without realizing it, I began to live a life that I never consciously chose, I just accepted. When I realized, the children were already with me almost all the time. In the beginning, they said it was temporary, only until things were organized. But no one ever explained what exactly needed to be organized. The days went by, and that, for now, was lengthening with no deadline to end. I woke up, prepared coffee, packed backpacks, took them to school. Everything happened so gradually that, when I realized it, the routine was already installed. The children did not complain much. They watched. They paid attention to everything. Sometimes they asked for their mother at unexpected times, such as before bed or during a simple meal. At those times, I felt the ground missing. I answered as I was taught, with vague phrases, trying to sound firm. He said that she needed a break, that she thought about them, that she loved them. Each time I repeated this, I felt a pang of guilt, even without knowing exactly why. There was no formal request for me to take over the creation of them. There was no clear conversation, no room for hesitation. People just started acting as if this was the only possible solution. Comments such as, "I'm glad they have you," came up frequently. I smiled, nodded, pretended to be safe. Inside, I felt afraid. Fear of not being able to cope. Fear of failure. Fear of occupying a place that was not mine. I started to reorganize my life around them. Schedules, plans, expectations. Everything was being adjusted without me realizing how much I was giving up on myself. I didn't feel authorized to complain. After all, everyone said I was doing something beautiful, something noble. And I needed to believe in that to continue. Questioning would mean admitting that something was wrong from the beginning. At night, when the house finally fell silent, I would sit alone and think about my sister. I wondered where she would be, if she thought about her children, if she was okay. These questions came loaded with anguish, but I quickly learned to push them away. Thinking too much hurt. And I had too many responsibilities to allow myself that kind of pain. Over time, the children began to call me for everything. I became a reference, support, constant presence. They bonded with me, and it touched me deeply. At the same time, there was a silent discomfort, as if I was occupying a space that should not be definitive. I loved those children, but I always knew that love was born of a poorly explained absence. Some people praised my dedication, others treated everything as a natural obligation. Your family. Someone had to take over. These phrases reinforced the idea that I had no real choice. I myself started to repeat this internally. I convinced myself that I was just doing what needed to be done, even though no one had asked me if I wanted to. There were times when I thought about seeking help, talking to someone outside. But I always gave up. I was afraid of hearing something that would force me to act. And acting would mean facing the family, breaking the silence, causing discomfort. I didn't know how to do that. I never knew. So I stayed where I was, sustaining a situation that seemed immutable. The children grew little by little, and I grew along with them in responsibilities. The bond strengthened, while the absence of the mother became an increasingly distant, almost abstract subject. It was as if that history was slowly being erased, replaced by a new version more convenient for everyone. Today, looking back, I realize that was the moment when my life ceased to belong to me completely. By assuming the children without questioning the context, I also assumed the silence that came along with them. I did this believing that I was protecting. It was only many years later that I understood that, by protecting, I also helped to hide a truth that should never have been buried. The first few years raising the children were marked by an intense but strangely automatic routine. I did what needed to be done without overthinking. I woke up early, organized everything, solved problems, kept schedules. There was not much room for reflection. Maybe I stuck to the routine just so I wouldn't think about the questions that came up when everything was too quiet. Children learned early not to dwell on certain subjects. I didn't have to say it directly. They noticed by my tone of voice, by the pauses, by the averted looks. When they asked about the mother, I answered briefly, carefully, always with the same phrases. Over time, these questions became rarer. And each time that happened, I felt relief mixed with guilt. In public, I was seen as someone admirable. People said I was strong, generous, responsible. These compliments sustained me more than they should. They acted as a constant validation that I was doing the right thing. The more they praised me, the less I allowed myself to question. After all, who questions something that everyone applauds? Inside the house, however, there were moments of heavy silence. Children grew older, and with them came more complex questions, even when they were not said aloud. I noticed this in the curious looks, in the comparisons with other families, in the stories they brought from school. Each of these situations reminded me that there was an absence that was never truly explained. I tried to compensate for this absence by being present in excess. She was always available, always attentive, always ready to solve any problem. Deep down, she believed that, if it were enough, perhaps no one would miss her mother so much. This idea accompanied me for years and shaped my way of loving, a love that was careful, protective, but also charged with the fear of failure. Sometimes at night, I allowed myself to think about my sister. At these times, guilt appeared more strongly. I wondered if she knew how her children were doing, if she imagined who was taking care of them, if she missed them. Soon after, came the thought that made me retreat, maybe it was better not to know. Maybe everything would be simpler that way. The family rarely touched on the subject. When it played, it was to reinforce the official version. She chose that. It's no use dwelling on it. The important thing is to move forward. These phrases acted as a constant reminder that any questioning would be seen as disloyalty. And I didn't want to be seen like that. He never wanted to. Over the years, I realized that I had incorporated this discourse myself. I began to repeat it to myself, to the children, to anyone who asked. It has become a kind of emotional protection. If I totally believed in that version, maybe I could live without this constant tightness in my chest. But the body doesn't always follow the stories the mind tells. I felt a deep tiredness, a tension that never completely disappeared. It wasn't something I knew how to explain, just feel. As if I was always on alert, waiting for something to come to light and destabilize everything I had built with so much effort. Creating without answers requires a specific type of denial. You learn to live with gaps, not to look directly at them. For many years, I did just that. I took care of, protected, sustained. But somewhere inside me, I knew that this story wasn't complete, just postponed. Over the years, I realized that my adult life was being built on decisions that I never really questioned. I got married, worked, fulfilled responsibilities, always with the feeling that I was following a script already written. I don't remember ever stopping to ask what I really wanted. The choices seemed natural, almost automatic, as if any other path was unfeasible for someone like me. Marriage came more as continuity than as a conscious choice. I was seen as someone stable, reliable, who would not cause problems. And I matched that image. I did my best to keep everything running, even when I felt like something inside me was always in the background. I learned not to demand too much, not to bother, to adapt. Raising the children along with my own life required constant strength. I was proud to be able to handle everything, but this pride was accompanied by exhaustion. There were days when I felt like I was just surviving, accomplishing tasks, keeping up appearances. Still, I told myself that this was what responsible people did. Guilt has become a silent companion. It wasn't directed at something specific, but it was always present. Sometimes it came up when I allowed myself to rest. Other times, when I felt any kind of personal satisfaction. As if I had no right to that as long as that story remained unresolved. In moments of greater fragility, I wondered if my sister would have made different choices if she had had support. Soon he pushed that thought away. He was too dangerous. To think about it meant to admit that something could have been avoided. And this possibility was too heavy to be faced for long. Over time, I developed an almost automatic ability to minimize my own emotions. If something hurt, I said it would pass. If something bothered me, I said it wasn't that important. This behavior helped me move forward, but it also pushed me away from myself. I could no longer clearly identify what I felt, I just knew how to bear it. The people around me saw a strong, organized woman, always available. Few realized how much this strength was sustained by the fear of falling apart. I avoided deep conversations, especially those that might touch on the past. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he feared he would not be able to stop once he had started. As the years passed, silence ceased to be just a strategy and became part of my identity. I no longer needed to be reminded not to speak. I myself automatically avoided certain thoughts. It was safer that way. At least that's what I believed. Still, there were times when everything seemed about to come to a head. A comment, a memory, an unexpected question. At those times, my heart raced, and I felt that old sense of danger. Not an external danger, but an internal one. The risk that the whole story would collapse if I allowed it. This is how I lived for many years, sustaining a functional life, but built on an old silence. I didn't know, at that time, that this silence had a deadline. That sooner or later, something would happen to break the fragile balance I maintained. And when that happened, nothing would be exactly the same as before. There was a moment when I realized that the fatigue I felt did not come only from routine. I was tired even on days when nothing got out of hand. It was a silent, constant tiredness, which did not improve with rest. I woke up already feeling the weight of the day, as if I was always carrying something I couldn't let go, even without knowing exactly what it was. People around me said that was normal. Which was age, the accumulation of responsibilities, life. I agreed, because to disagree would mean to look deeper. And looking deeper has always scared me. It was easier to accept ready-made explanations than to admit that my body was reacting to something my mind insisted on denying. I began to notice small changes in myself. Patience was decreasing. Sleep became lighter. The joy came in smaller doses. I continued to function, but without the same presence. It was as if I was always a little distant, observing my own life from the outside, fulfilling tasks without really inhabiting them completely. At times, I felt irritation for no clear reason. Other times, a sadness that came out of nowhere and disappeared without explanation. I never directly associated it with the past. On the contrary, he made a point of separating things. I told myself that it was behind me, that it didn't make sense to touch it after so many years. But the body does not respect agreements made in silence. He keeps what we can't say. And, little by little, he began to charge. Not abruptly, but persistently. A tightness in the chest here, a shortness of breath there, a constant feeling of being on alert. I learned to live with these signs as I learned to live with everything else, without questioning too much. There was also a strange feeling of always owing something. Like I was never doing enough, even when I was doing everything. This feeling accompanied me in small and large decisions. There was always a background guilt, difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore completely. Relationships also began to be affected. I avoided conflict at all costs, even when it meant canceling myself out. He preferred to give in, agree, silence. It was an old behavior, but it intensified over time. Confronting someone aroused in me a disproportionate fear, as if something much greater was at stake. When someone touched, even unintentionally, on my sister's subject, I felt the body react before the mind. A sudden chill, a knot in the stomach. I dodged, changed the subject, smiled. On the outside, it looked like control. Inside, it was panic. A silent, trained, ancient panic. I didn't call it suffering. I called it normal. After all, I had learned early on that feeling too much was a sign of weakness. So she moved on, carrying this invisible weight, convinced that it was part of adult life. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with needing to be so strong all the time. Today I understand that weight was not common fatigue. It was the consequence of years of living without truth. To sustain an incomplete story, to protect a silence that never really protected me. I didn't know it yet, at the time, but this invisible weight was about to become impossible to ignore. Time passed faster than I expected, and suddenly the children were no longer children. They became adults with opinions, memories of their own, and questions that could no longer be answered with vague phrases. At first, they were loose, almost unpretentious comments. Then came more direct questions, asked carefully, such as those who feel they are treading on sensitive ground. They wanted to know who the mother had been before she disappeared. What was his voice like, his way, his quirks? They asked her what she liked to do, what she laughed at, if she was similar to them in any way. These questions disarmed me. I realized how little I knew, or rather, how much I had avoided knowing. Each answer was accompanied by a lump in the throat. At first, I kept the version that I repeated for years. He said that she needed a break, that things were complicated, that she did what she thought was best. As he spoke, he felt a growing strangeness. The words sounded hollow even to me. For the first time, I clearly realized that this story no longer held. Their looks said a lot. They were not accusatory, but attentive. There was a genuine need to understand one's own past. I saw in them a mixture of nostalgia and confusion. They had grown up with a constant absence, but without sufficient explanations to elaborate on it. And I had been the main source of these incomplete explanations. At times, they asked if I really believed that the mother had simply chosen to leave. The question came carefully, but it carried a huge weight. I answered yes, but my voice no longer had the same firmness. For the first time, I felt ashamed of what I was saying. These conversations followed me after they left. I relived every question, every silence, every bad answer. Something inside me began to move, as if it had been dormant for too long. It was uncomfortable, but also impossible to ignore. I started to revisit old memories with different eyes. Situations that once seemed normal began to seem strange. Phrases said in the past have gained new meanings. Small details, previously irrelevant, began to connect in an uncomfortable way. It was as if a parallel story was emerging, silent but insistent. At the same time, I felt afraid. Fear of discovering something that would change everything. Fear of realizing that I had been deceived, or worse, that I had preferred not to see it. Questioning the past meant tinkering with structures that had sustained my life for decades. I didn't know if I was ready for it. Even so, something had already changed. I could no longer simply repeat the official version without feeling a deep tightness in my chest. Their questions had opened a crack, and through that crack came a truth that I could not yet name, but that was fast approaching. It was in this state of unease that the conversation that would change everything began to take shape. I still didn't know when or how, but I felt that the fragile balance I had maintained for so many years was about to crumble. And this time, it wasn't just my questions that would require answers. The conversation happened unexpectedly, like almost everything that really changes a life. It was not planned, nor actively sought. It came about in a chance encounter, one of those that seem insignificant at first. A person from the past, someone who was not part of my inner circle, but who knew my family history well. It only took a few sentences for me to feel that something was about to go out of place. At first, I didn't immediately understand what that person was implying. The words came carefully, as if there was fear of crossing an invisible limit. Loose comments, old memories, vague references to my sister. My body reacted before my mind. I felt a sudden cold, a family tension, that sense of danger that I knew so well. When I asked her directly what she meant, there was a pause too long. A heavy silence. It was there that I realized that this conversation was not common. Something had been kept for a long time. And now, for some reason, it was coming to light. The person took a deep breath before speaking, as if knowing that there is no turning back after what will be said. She said that my sister had not just left. He said that there was a lot of pressure, a lot of decisions made by others, a lot of things that were imposed as if they were choices. He said that everyone knew more than they let on. Every word seemed to weigh tons. I felt as if the ground was slowly opening up beneath my feet. My first reaction was to deny it. Not out loud, but inside. That contradicted everything I had repeated for years. I said that this didn't make sense, that if it was true someone would have spoken out before. The answer came simple and devastating: everyone thought it was better to keep quiet. This phrase kept echoing in my head. Everyone. It wasn't a person. It was not an isolated mistake. It was a collective decision. A choice of silence. Of control. Of convenience. And, at that moment, I began to realize that I was also part of this everyone, even though I had never realized it that way. The person counted fragments, without going into unnecessary details. He talked about tough conversations, veiled demands, emotional threats. He talked about how my sister was being cornered, until she saw no way out. Nothing I heard was too explicit, and perhaps that was what made it all the more cruel. It was the kind of pressure that leaves no visible marks, but destroys from within. As I listened, old images began to rearrange themselves in my mind. Looks, silences, phrases said in a tone that is too calm. Everything I had normalized began to take on another meaning. I felt nausea, shame, a deep sadness. For the first time, I seriously considered that my sister had not abandoned anyone. She was pushed out. When the conversation was over, I couldn't speak for a few seconds. The world around me seemed distant, unfocused. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. That revelation had gone through decades of denial in a few minutes. And along with it came a guilt that I had never allowed myself to feel completely. That day, something essential broke inside me. The story that sustained my life for so long began to crumble. I still didn't know how to deal with it, nor what I would do from there. I only knew one thing: I would never be able to say I didn't know again. And this awareness would change everything. After that conversation, I couldn't just move on like before. Something had been awakened, and there was no way he could fall asleep again. I began to revisit the past with different eyes, as if I were rereading an old story, now knowing that the ending was different. Small details, previously forgotten, began to emerge with unexpected force. I remembered the times when my sister tried to speak and was interrupted with firm delicacy. From the phrases that sounded like advice, but carried demands. This is not for you. Think about the children. Don't do that to the family. At the time, everything seemed to be a concern. Now, it sounded like carefully disguised control. Each memory was accompanied by a physical sensation. Tightness in the chest, short breathing, constant pressure on the head. I realized that my body recognized those memories even before my mind accepted them. It was as if I was finally allowing myself to feel something that had been blocked for decades. I started to wonder how many times my sister asked for help without using the right words. How many times have I been too close to notice, but too far to act? These questions did not come with clear answers, only with increasing weight. A weight made of regret and belated recognition. Some scenes came back with disconcerting clarity. The way she lowered her eyes after certain conversations. The constant tiredness that I attributed to routine. The way she accepted decisions that clearly hurt her. All of this was before me, and I chose to believe it was normal. I also realized how the official narrative had been repeated until it became unquestionable. She wanted to go. She needed it. There was no alternative. These phrases had been hammered so many times that they had become part of my own inner voice. Questioning them now was like questioning my entire identity. The guilt began to gain clearer form. It wasn't just because I didn't stop something. It was because he had helped to sustain the silence. For having welcomed the children without questioning the context. For having offered stability while the truth was pushed away. This realization hurt in a new, deeper way. There were times when I thought that maybe it would be better not to know all this. That living in ignorance had been simpler. But this idea was short-lived. The truth, even painful, had already set in. And ignoring it now would be a conscious choice, something I was no longer willing to do. I began to understand that no one needed to be cruel in an explicit way to cause so much harm. It was enough for everyone to agree to keep up appearances. It was enough for no one to help. This understanding was one of the most difficult, because it diluted the guilt among many, including me. As I put these pieces together, I felt something break definitively. There was no longer any way to sustain ancient history. She didn't explain anything else. What remained now was to decide what to do with this new understanding, and how to live with the weight of finally seeing what had always been there. What I'm going to say now is the hardest part of this whole story. To talk about it means to expose something that I have spent my whole life trying to protect, not out of shame, but for survival. If you've come this far, it's because you understand the weight of truths that are too expensive to say out loud. Subscribe to the channel, not as a support for me, but as a gesture to ensure that stories like this are not silenced again. The truth, when it finally begins to form in its entirety, does not come as a single shock. It comes in layers, each heavier than the last. As I put the pieces together, I realized that it was not an isolated misunderstanding, but a long, repeated process, carefully sustained over time. My sister was not just ignored. She was systematically pushed out. I found that the pressures started long before the day she disappeared. Constant conversations about what was expected of her, comparisons, demands disguised as concern. There was always someone telling her what she should do, for her children, for the family, to avoid problems. These phrases, spoken in a calm tone, functioned as invisible fences. Nothing was imposed directly enough to be called an order. And maybe that's why it worked so well. Choices were presented as inevitable. The consequences, such as guilt. It was placed before alternatives that were not really alternatives. Any attempt at resistance was treated as selfishness, as a lack of maturity, as a threat to the stability of all. What hurt me the most was realizing that this happened in front of many people. It was not a secret kept under lock and key. It was something known, commented on in a low tone, accepted as necessary. Everyone believed they were doing their best. And no one stopped to ask if it was destroying anyone in the process. My sister was being reduced to a problem to be solved. His pain became inconvenient. Their suffering, an obstacle. When she began to fall silent, this was interpreted as agreement. When he moved away emotionally, he was seen as cold. And when it finally disappeared, the more convenient version won without resistance. Realizing all this was devastating. Not only because of the cruelty of what was done to her, but because of the clarity with which I understood my place in all this. I was the practical solution. The one that welcomed the children, the one that kept everything running, the one that allowed the rest of the family to move on without looking back. For many years, I was proud of this attitude. Today, it weighs like never before. Not because I did something out of malice, but because I accepted it without question. I was one more cog in a system that silenced someone until they disappeared completely. There was a moment when I thought that maybe my sister had chosen this out of exhaustion. But even this idea carries injustice. Being brought to a point where disappearing seems like the only way out is not a choice. It's survival. And that distinction changed everything for me. I cried like I hadn't cried in years. It wasn't a loud, desperate cry. It was a contained, late cry, full of painful understanding. I cried for her, for his children, and for myself, which took me so long to see. The truth that hurts the most is not just what was done to my sister. It is knowing that, if someone had broken the silence before, perhaps everything would have been different. And now, carrying this awareness, I needed to decide whether to remain silent, or whether to finally do something with this truth. After accepting the truth, I realized that silence was no longer a neutral option. To remain silent meant to consciously choose the same path as before. Still, confronting seemed daunting. Not because I feared screaming or rejection, but because I knew I would tamper with old structures, carefully preserved for decades. I started with discreet conversations, one person at a time. I did not arrive accusing, nor demanding full explanations. I just asked. I observed reactions. Some people looked away immediately. Others pretended not to understand what I was talking about. There was a clear discomfort, as if I was breaking an unwritten rule. Some admitted parts of the story. Never everything. Always fragments. She was difficult. The situation was out of control. We thought it was better this way. These phrases were accompanied by quick justifications, as if it were still necessary to protect old decisions. No one seemed willing to say out loud that it had been wrong. Others reacted with absolute denial. They said that I was confusing things, that the past could not be judged with the eyes of today. They spoke of gratitude, of sacrifice, of all that had been done for the children. At no time did they talk about what was done to my sister. I realized then that the confrontation would not bring reparation in the sense I imagined. There would be no clear apology, no full acknowledgement of the damage caused. What there was fear. Fear of admitting that decisions made on behalf of the family had destroyed someone. At times, I felt like screaming, to demand complete answers. But something in me was already changing. I no longer needed their validation to know what had happened. The truth did not depend on the agreement of those who helped to hide it. The hardest thing was to realize that, for many, silence still seemed the best option. Not out of malice, but out of emotional convenience. Admitting the truth would mean living with guilt, and not everyone was willing to do that. I came away from these conversations exhausted, but strangely lighter. For the first time, I had spoken. Not everything, not in the ideal way, but enough to break the silent pact that accompanied me for so long. This, in itself, was already a huge change. I understood that confronting does not mean winning. Sometimes, it just means stopping carrying a weight that was never yours alone. I didn't need to convince anyone. He just needed not to keep pretending. When I chose to speak, even without great reactions, I realized that something essential had moved inside me. Silence no longer completely defined me. And this small rupture made room for the most difficult step of all, telling the truth to those who were most affected by it. Telling my sister's children the truth was undoubtedly the hardest time of my entire life. I put off this conversation for weeks, maybe months, trying to find the right way, the right time, the least painful words. Deep down, I knew that there was no easy way. The truth would not come as immediate relief. It would come as a rupture. When we finally sat down together, I felt my whole body tremble. It wasn't fear of them, but fear of the impact of what I was about to say. I spent years being the person who offered security. Now, I was about to dismantle the history that I myself helped build to protect them, or at least that's what I believed for a long time. I started talking slowly, resuming who their mother was before she disappeared. I told her about the dreams she had, how much she loved her children, how suffocated she felt. I watched each reaction carefully. Long silences. Staring. Breaths contained. They listened without interrupting, as if they already knew that this conversation could not be interrupted. When I explained that their mother hadn't simply chosen to leave, I saw something change on their faces. It was not an immediate shock. It was confusion. As if an important piece had finally been put in place, but it still hurt to accept the new complete image. I talked about the pressures, about control, about collective silence. I didn't go into unnecessary details. Just enough for them to understand that the abandonment they felt was not rejection, that the absence of the mother did not mean a lack of love. As I spoke, I felt tears flow, but I kept going. That was a truth that needed to be told in its entirety. They asked few questions. And the ones they did were simple, direct, devastating. Did she want to stay? Did she try? Did anyone help? Each question was an open wound. I answered honestly, even when the answer was no. Especially when it was no. There was pain, anger, sadness. Emotions that arose in waves, in no defined order. I didn't try to contain anything. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to control what was happening. I just remained there, present, accepting the discomfort that this truth caused. At some point, I noticed something unexpected. Along with the pain, there was also relief. A kind of silent relief, difficult to explain. As if there was finally permission to feel what has always been there, but without a name. They no longer had to wonder what they had done wrong. At the end of the conversation, there was no clear conclusion. There was no way there could be. Just a new understanding, still fragile, still painful. But true. And that, I realized, was more respectful of their mother's memory than any prolonged silence. When I was alone afterwards, I felt a deep tiredness, but different from all the others I met. It was honest tiredness. For the first time, I wasn't carrying a lie to protect anyone. The truth had been told. And from that moment on, nothing could ever be the same again. After telling the truth, I realized that something had definitely changed inside me. It was not an immediate relief, nor a feeling of victory. It was more subtle. As if an ancient weight had finally been placed on the ground, even though it was still there, visible. For the first time, I no longer needed to sustain versions, nor to protect silences that never really protected me. I started to revisit my own story with more honesty. I understood that many of the choices I made were not entirely free, but conditioned by fear, expectations, and a distorted sense of responsibility. This does not erase what I experienced, but it changes the way I see myself within this narrative. I wasn't just strong. I was trained to endure. I also had to accept that not everyone wanted to hear the truth. Some people preferred to keep their distance, others continued to deny it. And, for the first time, it didn't destabilize me. I no longer needed their agreement to move forward. Their silence was now their choice, no longer an imposition on me. My sister's children began, little by little, to reconstruct their own history. Not in a linear way, nor in a simple way. But with something they've never had before, context. They started to talk about their mother with less confusion and less guilt. And that, in itself, was already a form of belated reparation. As for me, I learned that taking on everything alone is not a virtue when it serves to cover up injustices. I learned that being strong all the time exacts too high a price. And that questioning does not destroy families, what destroys is pretending that nothing happened. There was no perfect ending. I didn't meet my sister again. I couldn't get complete answers. Some gaps remained, but, unlike before, they are no longer supported by lies. They are spaces of recognized pain, and that changes everything. Today, when I look back, I clearly see how silence was used as a tool of control. As everyone knew a little, but no one helped. As I myself believed that being quiet was the safest way. This understanding no longer paralyzes me. It strengthens me in a different way. If this story touched you, share this video. Not because it is my experience, but because it reveals patterns that still silence many people. Maybe there's someone near you who needs to hear that today, and sharing can be the first step in breaking that cycle. If I learned something from all this, it was that time does not erase truths. He just waits. Wait until someone is willing to look at them without swerving. It took me a lifetime to do this, but still, it was worth it. Today I speak because I know that there are many people living similar stories. People who carry guilt that is not theirs. People who were silenced or who helped to silence without realizing it. The truth may hurt, but prolonged silence hurts much more. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told, but even when they arrive late, they still matter. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me what city or country you're watching from, and what about this story stayed with you. Really, your words mean more to me than you think.